23 women came to Granite Peak Ranch looking for a husband. 23 women were turned away. Then she walked 12 miles through a killing blizzard in borrowed boots with $37 to her name. The advertisement had promised one husband. She found three brothers instead, and a door that had never opened for anyone. This is her story. She walked the last 12 miles alone. The stagecoach driver had refused to go further. Said the mountain road was suicide in this weather. Said no woman in her right mind would try it on foot. She tried it anyway because the alternative was worse than any blizzard. The advertisement had promised one husband. What waited at the end of that frozen mountain road was something the advertisement never mentioned. Three brothers, one ranch, and a door that had been closed to 23 women before her. But that moment was still hours away. To understand how Clara Whitfield ended up standing in a stranger's entry hall with frostbitten hands and borrowed boots, men's boots, 3 sizes too large, stuffed with cloth at the toes, you have to go back to that morning, back to the sound of a fist hitting mahogany hard enough to make whiskey jump. Before we continue, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let us go back to that morning. The sound of Silas Garrett's fist striking his desk echoed through the 14-room ranch house like a rifle shot. The whiskey glass leaped an inch off the polished wood surface. Papers scattered cattle contracts, feed orders correspondence from 3 territorial suppliers fanning across the desk in a spray of yellow and white. And in the entry hall below, the 23rd woman to seek marriage at Granite Peak Ranch was being escorted to her waiting carriage by old Hank Dawson, who tipped his hat and said nothing. After 23 rejections, there was nothing left to say. Silas stood at the window of his second-floor study, watching the carriage retreat down the mountain road like a dark beetle crawling across white linen. February 1878, Wyoming Territory. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight. The wind cut through the Elkhorn Valley like something alive and furious, howling between the ridges with a sound that was less weather and more grief, as if the mountains themselves were mourning something they refused to name. Below him, 15,000 acres of cattle ranch spread across Granite Peak. 3 major streams fed by mountain snowmelt. 4,000 head of cattle, their dark shapes huddled against the storm in sheltered draws and timber breaks. 14 buildings. Barns, bunkhouse, smokehouse, ice house, blacksmith, forge, and the main house. One massive house built by a dead man for a family that never came. Silas Garrett was 33 years old, and he had been running this ranch since he was 22. Every fence post, every water trough, every contract and cattle deal bore the imprint of his hands and his will. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, carried 230 pounds of muscle built by 14 years of mountain ranch work, and his hands were big and calloused and scarred from decades of labor that most men could not survive and fewer would choose. But it was not his body that defined him. It was the architecture beneath it, the fortress, the walls, the drawbridge that rose the moment anyone got close, the certainty maintained for 5 years and reinforced every single day that no one would ever get inside again. His test for potential brides was simple. They had to arrive independently. No escort, no carriage, no family clearing the way, no political delegation announcing their arrival like a campaign event. No woman traveled alone in Wyoming Territory in 1878, not in winter, not on foot, not without protection. The test was designed to be impossible. That was the entire point. Silas Garrett did not want anyone to pass. Emmett entered the study without knocking. He never knocked. Middle brothers do not knock. They occupy space as though it has always been theirs. He leaned against the door frame, his weight shifted to one hip, his arms loose at his sides. Those same whiskey amber eyes that all 3 Garrett brothers shared, watching Silas with a patience that bordered on provocation. That was Senator Crawford's cousin, Emmett said. His tone was observational, not accusatory. He was stating facts the way a lawyer presents evidence, letting the information do the work. I didn't need to hear the rest. Her uncle did all the talking. Silas did not turn from the window. His voice had gone flat. That was the register both brothers recognized. It meant the wall was going up. The drawbridge was rising. The fortress was sealing shut. That isn't marriage, Emmett. That's acquisition. Maybe she wanted to come. Then she would have come alone. There it was, the test. the impossible standard that 23 women had failed, not because they lacked independence, but because the test was designed to filter out every living woman in Wyoming territory. It was Silas's measure of character, his litmus for sincerity, and every woman had failed it. He had been failing them on purpose for 5 years. Boone appeared in the hallway behind Emmett. He had been in the barn. There was hay in his hair and the smell of horses on his sheepskin coat. The youngest Garrett did not lean against anything. He stood straight, hands in his pockets, and his expression carried the thing Silas found most unbearable: sadness. Not for the rejected woman, for his brother. She seemed kind, Boone said quietly. Kind doesn't survive this mountain. Ma was kind. She survived it. The room went silent. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread through all three brothers, simultaneously touching different shores in each of them. Their mother, Margaret Garrett, had died when Boone was 6, Emmett 10, and Silas 13. Fever took her during a winter, not unlike this one, when the snow piled so high against the windows that daylight came through blue and cold filtered through ice crystals that turned the world inside the ranch house into something beautiful and terrible and absolutely silent. Silent except for the sound of a woman dying in the room where she had taught her sons to read. Their father, Thomas Garrett, never recovered. He built the ranch bigger and bigger, as if square footage could fill the hole she left, as if timber and stone could substitute for the warmth that went into the ground with her. He expanded from 200 acres to 500, then 1,000, then 5,000, driven by a grief that looked like ambition, but was really just a man trying to build something large enough to contain his loss. Then Thomas died of a heart attack when Silas was 22. Collapsed in the barn on a Tuesday morning in March, one hand still holding a curry brush, the other clutching his chest. Left 3 young men with 200 acres of cleared land, 40 head of cattle, and a debt to the territorial bank that should have buried them alongside their parents. It did not bury them. Silas would not allow it. In the 11 years since Silas Garrett had converted grief into labor and labor into empire, with the systematic efficiency of a man who understood that if he ever stopped working, ever allowed himself one idle hour, one unproductive thought, one moment of quiet in which the loneliness could catch up to him, he would drown in it. So he never stopped. He built, he fenced, he contracted, he expanded. He turned 200 acres into 15,000 and 40 head of cattle into 4,000, and he did it with his own hands and his brother's hands and the iron will of a man who had decided that if the world was going to take everything from him, he would build something too large to take. The cost of this building was Catherine Prescott. 6 years before Clara Whitfield walked through a blizzard to knock on Silas Garrett's door, a woman named Catherine Prescott had slept in the guest room on the 2nd floor of the Granite Peak Ranch House. She had stayed for 3 months. She had been beautiful, educated from a good Boston family. She had laughed at Silas's rough edges and tried to sand them smooth. She wanted him to leave Wyoming, move east, become civilized. She said he was too much frontier and not enough future. Silas told her this land was who he was. Catherine boarded a train the next morning and never came back. She took with her not just herself, but Silas's capacity for trust. His willingness to believe that anyone could see past the land to the man who built it, could love the rancher and not just the ranch, could choose the frontier over comfort and mean it. That first year after Catherine left, Silas shut down completely. Would not see anyone, would not go to town, just worked. 14 hours a day, 7 days a week until his hands bled and his body ached, and the work drowned out the voice in his head that said she was right. You are too, huh? No one will ever choose this life. No one will ever choose you. Then word about the ranch spread. Women started arriving, or rather their families started sending them. Senators' daughters, bankers' nieces, merchants' cousins. 23 in 5 years. Each one arrived with an escort, a dowry, a family name, a political agenda. Each one failed the test that was designed to be failed, and Silas turned every single one of them away. Don't, Silas said to Boone. One word, but it carried the weight of years, years of building, years of refusing to bend, years of converting grief into labor and labor into empire. Don't use her to argue for strangers. Boone held his brother's gaze for a moment, long enough to register disagreement, short enough to avoid the kind of confrontation that would crack something neither of them could repair. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Emmett watched him go, then looked at Silas. You know he's right. I know he's 26 years old and still believes people are good. Some of them are. Name one. Emmett considered this. Hank. Hank isn't people. Hank is furniture. He came with the land. There was almost humor in Silas's voice, the barest crack in the ice. Emmett noted it, filed it away in the part of his mind that cataloged useful information and left without pressing further. He knew when to push and when to wait. Middle brothers learned that early, or they did not survive. Hank Dawson found Silas in the study an hour later. The whiskey glass had been refilled and sat untouched on the desk. And that detail told Hank everything he needed to know. A man who pours whiskey and drinks it is tired. A man who pours whiskey and stares at it is fighting something that liquor cannot fix. Hank was 62 years old, built like the barnwood he resembled. Weathered hard, slightly warped by decades of use, but structurally sound and likely to outlast anything built after him. He had been working Garrett land since before the brothers were born. He had served their father Thomas, survived their mother Margaret's death, watched 3 boys become men, who became something harder than men usually needed to be. And he had opinions about all of it that he shared exactly when he wanted to, and never a moment sooner. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. He had earned that right through decades of loyalty and the quiet understanding that Silas respected people who did not ask permission for things they had already paid for. 23, Hank said. I can count. Can you? Because from where I sit, you're counting the wrong things. Hank's voice was casual, but his eyes, blue and sharp and undimmed by age, were anything but. You're counting women who failed your test. Maybe you should count the years you've been alone instead. I'm not alone. I have Emmett Boone, you Bessie 12 ranch hands. You have employees and brothers. That is not the same thing as having someone who chooses you. Hank stood heading for the door. He paused, one weathered hand on the frame. Your father made the same mistake. Built this place so big there was no room left for living in it. My father died of a broken heart. No. Your father died because he believed work was a substitute for love. And you're doing the same thing, only more successfully. Hank paused again. His voice dropped. Not softer, but more honest. I'm 62, Silas. I buried a wife, raised no children, spent my whole life on someone else's land. Don't follow my path. It's colder than you think. He left. Silas stared at the whiskey, drank it in one swallow, poured another, did not drink that one either. The morning routine at Granite Peak Ranch proceeded with the mechanical precision of men who had turned survival into habit and habit into something that almost resembled a life. Silas was up before dawn as always. He pulled on his sheepskin coat, heavy as armor, and stepped outside to check the thermometer hanging beside the main barn door. 20 below. Northeast wind. He calculated in his head the way a general calculates before battle. The north herd needed checking. The fence line along Pine Creek needed repair where a fallen tree had crushed 2 sections of wire last week. And the water troughs in the main horse barn needed their ice broken before the animals could drink. He crossed the yard in the blue-gray light, his boots crunching on packed snow, and picked up the 10-pound sledgehammer that hung inside the barn door. The ice in the trough was 4 inches thick, formed overnight in the brutal cold. He swung the hammer with the same precision he brought to everything. Each strike landed in the same spot, sending shards of ice spinning into the dim morning air. No wasted motion, no wasted energy. This was how Silas Garrett lived. Everything had a purpose. Every action served a function. There was no room for excess, not in movement, not in emotion, not in the words he spoke to the people around him. Inside the main barn, Boone was already with the horses moving between stalls, with the quiet confidence of a man who understood animals better than he understood people. He checked each one the way their mother had taught him, though he barely remembered her teaching it. Start with the feet, lift each hoof, check for stones, cracks, signs of laminitis. Then the eyes, bright and clear means healthy. Cloudy or weeping means trouble. Then the breathing, 8 to 12 breaths per minute at rest. Faster could mean fever. Finally, the feed, how much oats consumed, how much water drunk. Every detail went into the leather notebook he carried in his belt, the same notebook their mother had used. Her handwriting was still visible on the first page, faded but legible. Take care of the animal before you take care of yourself. He stopped at the stall of a chestnut mare named Copper, heavy with foal. He ran his hand along her swollen belly, feeling for movement, his touch gentle enough to calm her, firm enough to assess. "Soon now, girl," he murmured. "Maybe next week." He hung an extra blanket over the partition to block the draft that whistled through a gap in the timber. Small gesture, enormous care. In the study, Emmett had been working since 5 o'clock, the oil lamp burning on the desk amid stacks of paperwork. Government cattle contracts needed renewing. Winter feed orders for oats, hay, and mineral salt had to reach Cheyenne before the road became impassable. He wrote letters to 3 suppliers in sharp, clean handwriting, black ink on yellow paper. The Garrett Ranch seal stamped in red wax at the bottom of each one. Numbers were his language. Contracts were his battlefield. Where Silas built with his hands and Boone tended with his heart, Emmett defended with his mind. And in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, Bessie Monroe had been up since 4 o'clock. The cast iron cook stove, 400 pounds of metal, hauled by ox cart from Cheyenne a decade ago, had burned all night. She stirred the coals and added 2 splits of seasoned dough and set the sourdough to rise on the warming shelf. The smell of bread yeast blended with wood smoke and the coffee already brewing in the big copper pot on the rear plate. 4 scoops of ground coffee to a quart of water boiled hard, then left to settle for 3 minutes. That was how her mother made it in Tennessee before the war, and Bessie saw no reason to improve upon perfection. Breakfast was at 6. 3 brothers at the long table, Silas at the head, Emmett to his left, Boone to his right, 12 ranch hands at a separate table in the adjacent room. Bessie served bacon-sliced thick eggs fried in the drippings, hot bread with butter, and coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. Conversation was brief, practical, and conducted in the shorthand of men who had worked together so long that complete sentences were an unnecessary luxury. Today's work, weather forecast based on wind direction and cloud type, status of the cattle. Nobody mentioned the 23rd woman. Nobody needed to. After breakfast, Silas rode out to the Pine Creek fence line alone. He carried his tool bag across the saddle horn. Wire cutters post-hammered a coil of new barbed wire metal clamps. The temperature was low enough to make steel brittle, and a man who bent cold wire the wrong way would snap it like glass. He heated each end with a small torch before twisting it around the post. Steam rising from hot metal, meeting frozen air. His hands big and calloused and scarred from years of this exact work, moved with the precision that only experience teaches. Each knot was tight. Each post was straight. Each section of wire was tensioned just right. Not too tight, because wire that cannot contract in cold will break. Not too loose, because cattle will find the weakness and push through. There was a science to fencing that most men never learn, because most men did not fence in 20 below weather on a mountainside in February. This was the kind of work Silas loved. Honest, physical, measurable. You could see what you had done at the end of the day. You could point to a repaired fence and say that holds. That protects. That keeps what is mine from wandering into the dark. He had been at it for 3 hours when he heard riders. Virgil Hale and Gus Redmond brought their horses alongside his breath, fogging in the savage cold. Virgil was 24, the youngest of the ranch hands, still new enough to be excited by most things and frightened by the rest. Gus was 38, steady as bedrock, a man who spoke only when words were necessary and never wasted one. "Boss, there's someone at the main house," Virgil said. "Already told Bessie I'm not receiving visitors." "She won't leave." Silas's jaw tightened. "She came on foot." Gus's voice was carefully neutral. He was presenting information without recommendation, because he had learned years ago that Silas Garrett did not accept recommendations. No carriage, no horse, no escort. Walked up the mountain road alone in this weather. Silas's wire cutter stopped mid-motion. His hands froze on the handles. No woman walked alone in Wyoming territory. Not in February, not on foot, not up a mountain road in a blizzard that had already killed 2 head of range cattle this week. The fact that someone had done this, had done the one thing his impossible test demanded, created the first crack in a certainty he had maintained for 5 years. "She asked for you by name," Gus added quietly. "Asked for Garrett. Said she'd wait as long as it took. Not the owner, not the ranch. Garrett. She had come for the man, not the land. And she was not leaving without an answer." "She looks half frozen, boss," Virgil said, and there was something in his voice. The protective instinct of a young man raised right. Bessie has her by the fire, but she won't eat, won't take a blanket. Just sits there, waiting. Silas felt the old anger rise. Not at this woman, whoever she was, at whatever circumstance had driven a person to walk 12 miles through killing cold to knock on a stranger's door. He had turned away senators' daughters in silk dresses and political connections. He had refused bankers' nieces with dowries that could purchase half of Laramie. He had rejected every calculated arrangement Wyoming society could manufacture. But he had never confronted someone desperate enough to walk through death to reach him. Damn it! He swung into the saddle with the fluid motion of a man who had been mounting horses since he could walk. Let's go. The ride back took 40 minutes through snow so deep, the horses waded belly-high in places. By the time they reached the main house, the sky had darkened to the color of bruised iron, and the storm had intensified from dangerous to lethal. Silas dismounted and found not just Hank waiting on the porch, but both his brothers. Emmett leaned against the porch post. Of course he did. Boone stood straight, hands at his chin, and his expression carried that quality Silas found most threatening: hope. Before you throw her out, Hank started, I'll decide what happens in my house. Silas pushed past them, tracking snow across the entry hall, his spurs ringing on the hardwood, already composing the speech he had delivered 23 times. You are not welcome here. The road is that direction. I wish you well elsewhere. Then he saw her. Clara Whitfield sat in the chair nearest the fire, not huddled for warmth, sitting straight-backed, hands folded in her lap. The way women are taught to sit when they have nothing left but dignity. Her traveling dress was navy blue, good quality but worn thin, dusty from a journey that clearly involved more walking than any dress was designed for. Her boots were men's boots, too large, stuffed with cloth to make them fit. That single detail told a story of resourcefulness that struck Silas harder than beauty ever could. She had no proper shoes for this journey, so she found shoes that would get her here. Problem identified, problem solved. No complaint offered. Her honey blonde hair had partially fallen from its pins, and the firelight caught it in ways that turned ordinary into something that made a man forget what he had been planning to say. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely. Cornflower blue. Large, exhausted beyond measure, and completely, utterly unafraid. They met his gaze without the practiced charm he had seen in bankers' daughters. Without the desperate hope of women sent by ambitious fathers, without calculation of any kind. She looked at him the way you look at a locked door when you have walked a very long way and have nowhere else to go. Not with expectation, just with the quiet acknowledgement that this is where the road ends, whatever happens next. She stood when he entered. All three brothers were behind him now, Silas in front, Emmett to his left, Boone to his right. Three men of extraordinary size, filling the entry hall, with the kind of physical presence that made most people retreat. Clara did not retreat. Mr. Garrett, she said. Her voice was low and steady. Not a question. She was addressing all three of them. Which one? Emmett asked from behind Silas. There was dry humor in it, his default setting the tone he used when situations interested him more than they alarmed him. Clara's eyes moved between the three of them. Silas saw the moment realization struck her. The advertisement had said, "Seek Garrett." She had expected one man. She was looking at three who shared the same jaw, the same amber eyes, the same build that came from years of the same brutal mountain labor. All three of you, apparently, she said, and there was something in her tone. Not defeat, not humor, a kind of exhausted recognition that the universe had once again exceeded her capacity for surprise. You need to leave, Silas said. I will, after we talk. There's nothing to talk about. Then I'll be brief. She did not move closer, did not appeal to sympathy, did not perform. She simply stated facts the way a person does when they have run out of energy for anything else. My name is Clara Whitfield. I answered your advertisement for a mail-order bride. I traveled from Boston by train by stagecoach and the last 12 miles on foot because the stagecoach would not come this far in the storm. I have no family who wants me. I have no money. I have no other prospects. And based on the 23 women you have already turned away, I suspect you have no intention of accepting me either. The room went silent. Bessie had stopped working in the kitchen. Hank stood motionless near the stairs. Even Emmett had stopped leaning. "So why are you here?" Silas asked. "Because the alternative was marrying a man 3 times my age to settle debts I never incurred in a city that killed my father." Her voice did not waver. Her eyes did not drop. "And I decided I would rather freeze to death in Wyoming than live that life." The honesty of it, the complete absence of strategy or seduction or performance. She was not trying to win them. She was telling the truth. And truth was the one weapon that none of them, not even Silas with his fortress and his walls, knew how to defend against. "Bessie," Silas called without taking his eyes off Clara, "set another place for dinner." "Already done," Bessie said from the kitchen, and the smile in her voice carried through the house like warmth from a fire. Emmett's eyebrow rose. Boone's face softened into something that looked dangerously like relief. "You can stay tonight," Silas said. "Storm's too bad to send you back. But in the morning you leave." "Agreed." She sat back down with the same straight-back composure. And Silas walked away before the questions crowding his mind could escape his mouth. Who was she really? What was she running from? And why did she look at him like she could see through walls he had spent 6 years building? Dinner was the first time all four of them sat at the long table together, and the table itself told the story better than words ever could. 4 places set along a stretch of oak that could have seated a congregation. The empty chairs outnumbered the occupied ones 3 to 1, and the silence between them was louder than any conversation. Bessie served pot roast with potatoes, root vegetables from the cellar, and bread still warm from the oven. She watched the exchange between Silas and Clara with the intensity of a woman who had waited 12 years for exactly this moment. Silas asked questions the way a prosecutor conducts cross-examination. Short, direct, designed to establish facts rather than build understanding. "You're from Boston." "I am." "What brought you west?" Clara set down her fork. Her movements were precise. No wasted energy. She looked at Silas directly the way few people ever did, because most people found the full weight of those amber eyes difficult to bear. "My father was a shipping merchant. He invested everything in a fleet that sank. The insurance company refused the claim. He lost the business, the house, everything." She paused. "He was a proud man. Proud men don't survive humiliation well. He died. Pneumonia, the doctor said. His lungs, I say his spirit." No emotion in her voice. Just fact, delivered clean and unsoftened. "He died owing money to half of Boston. His brother, my uncle Harold Whitfield, took guardianship, settled some debts, created others." "Created." Emmett leaned forward slightly. The strategist in him was listening now, hearing patterns in the information, the way he heard them in cattle contracts and political maneuvering. "My uncle is a man who sees opportunity in other people's misfortune." Clara's gaze shifted to the middle brother, and Silas noticed she addressed each of them distinctly. Not as a unit, as individuals. "He arranged for me to marry Edgar Braddock, a businessman, 55 years old, very wealthy, very interested in acquiring a young wife to manage his household and produce heirs." "And you refused," Boone said. His voice carried its usual gentleness, but beneath it ran something harder. The protective anger of a man who could not tolerate cruelty toward the vulnerable. "I refused." "What happened?" "My uncle called me ungrateful, said I owed my father's memory, said the debts would follow me wherever I went." Clara took a sip of water. "So I tested that theory. I took the $37 I had left and bought a train ticket as far west as it would reach. In Cheyenne, I saw your advertisement at the posting office." "Our advertisement asked for a woman of good character and strong constitution," Emmett said. "It doesn't mention that the groom is actually 3 men." For the first time, something close to humor crossed Clara's face. A ghost of a smile that appeared and vanished so quickly Silas was not sure he had seen it. "No, it neglected that detail." "That was my doing," Emmett admitted. "I placed the advertisement. Silas wanted it pulled after the first 5 responses. I kept it running." Silas's head turned toward his brother with the slow, dangerous precision of a man who has just been informed of a betrayal he should have anticipated. "You did what?" "Somebody had to try." Emmett held his brother's glare without flinching. "We need help on this ranch, Silas. Bessie can't cook for 15 men and maintain a house this size alone forever. We need someone to manage accounts, handle correspondence, organize supply chains. And yes, we need someone who makes this house feel like something other than a mausoleum. I didn't agree to that. You didn't need to. I own a third of this ranch. So does Boone. The tension between the brothers crackled like static before lightning. Clara watched it with those perceptive blue eyes, and Silas had the unsettling sensation that she was seeing not just the argument, but everything beneath it. The loneliness, the fear. Three men who had built walls so high they had walled themselves in. I'm not looking for a husband, Clara said quietly. Everyone turned to her. I answered your advertisement because I had no other options. But I'm not here to charm anyone. I'm not here to be decorative. I'm not here to manage your household as though that were some kind of consolation prize for not being wanted. Her voice was steady, precise, carrying an intelligence that surprised the room. If you'll have me, I will work. I will earn my keep. But I will not pretend this is a courtship when it is survival. Hank, who had been eating silently, chuckled into his pot roast. Lord, she's going to be trouble. The best kind, Bessie added from the kitchen doorway. Eat your dinner, all of you. It's getting cold. That night, the house settled into its usual silence, but the silence felt different, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm when you can taste the electricity on your tongue. Clara was given this guest room on the second floor, the one that had not been used since Catherine Prescott stayed a single night and left the next morning, taking Silas's capacity for trust with her. Bessie had aired the linens and lit a fire in the small stone hearth, and the room smelled of wood smoke and lavender sachets tucked into the pillowcases years ago by a woman who believed in preparing for guests who never came. Near midnight, Silas sat in the chair in the corner of that room, watching the stranger sleep. He did not know why he was there, could not have explained it to Emmett's analytical mind or Boone's hopeful heart. He only knew that the image of her walking those 12 miles through a blizzard in shoes that did not belong to her had lodged somewhere behind his ribs and would not dislodge, and that sitting in this chair listening to her breathe was the first thing he had done in 6 years that was not about the ranch or the cattle or the walls. She stirred, gasped as pain shot through her ankle. Bessie had wrapped it in cloth and packed it with snow to reduce the swelling from the long walk. Easy, Silas said. She had not known he was there. Her eyes found him in the darkness, and for a moment neither of them moved. How long have you been sitting there? Does it matter? I think it does. She settled back against the pillows. Are the cattle safe? I heard the hands talking about a section of north fence down. Cattle are fine. Fence will hold until morning. Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind screamed through the valley with a sound like something grieving. Nobody has risked themselves for me in a very long time, Silas said, and the words came out before he could stop them. He was not talking about tonight. He was talking about something larger, something that had calcified inside him over 6 years of solitude and rejection in the daily practice of needing no one. That's because you don't let anyone close enough to try, Clara said. The observation landed the way all her words did, without performance, without strategy. Just honest perception delivered in a voice that was too tired for anything but the truth. You see too much, he said. I see what's there. All three of you built this mountain into a fortress. Silas, you built the walls. Emmett designed the gates. Boone guards the heart of it. And none of you know how to let anyone inside because the last time you did, someone left. You don't know about that. I know loss, Clara said. I watched my father build a life and lose it. I watched despair consume a good man. I know what it does to the people left behind. It teaches you that love isn't protection, that wanting someone can't save them, that sometimes the safest thing is to stop wanting altogether. Her name was Catherine, Silas said. The admission cost him something visible, a tightening in his jaw, a shift in his breathing, the kind of physical tells that only people paying close attention would notice. Clara was paying close attention. 6 years ago, she wanted me to leave Wyoming, move to Boston, become civilized. She said I was too much frontier and not enough future. She wanted you smaller. Yes, and you refused. I told her this land was who I am. She left the next morning. That first year after I shut everything down, wouldn't see anyone or wouldn't go to town, just worked. Then word about the ranch spread and women started arriving. families sending their daughters, 23 in 5 years. And I turned every single one of them away because none of them saw past the land to the man who built it. Until me. The words hung between them. Silas stood abruptly. You should rest. Silas. She said his name. Just his. Not Mr. Garrett, not all three of you, just his name spoken in a voice that was gentle and firm at the same time. And the intimacy of it stopped him at the door. Thank you, she said, for sitting with me. He did not turn around. He could not, because if he did, she would see that his eyes were burning, and Silas Garrett had not let anyone see him that vulnerable since he was 22 years old, standing at the edge of a grave, watching his father's coffin go into the frozen ground. Rest, he said, and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and breathed. And downstairs, Emmett, who never slept when there was something worth observing, noted the time, the closed door, and the expression on his eldest brother's face when he finally descended the stairs. She's going to stay, isn't she? Emmett said. Silas did not answer, but he did not say no. And for the Garrett brothers, that silence was seismic. The blizzard settled in the next day with a ferocity that turned the world outside the ranch house into something hostile and absolute. Wind speeds reached levels that threatened structures. Snow accumulated so rapidly that the hands worked in shifts just to keep the barn doors accessible. The thermometer beside the main barn dropped so low the mercury seemed to have given up entirely. Clara was awake before dawn. Silas found her in the kitchen, standing beside Bessie, at the big iron stove, cracking eggs into a skillet, with the efficient motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. You don't need to do that, he said from the doorway. I'm not paying for my stay with idleness. You're not paying at all. You're a guest. Guest implies invitation. She glanced at him over her shoulder, and for one brief instant their eyes held. I showed up uninvited in a blizzard. That makes me an obligation. Let me at least be a useful one. Bessie snorted from the stove. Girl has more sense than the three of you combined. Let her work if she wants to. Within 3 days, Clara had reorganized Bessie's pantry from floor to ceiling, labeling every jar, sorting by type, creating a written inventory that told Bessie at a glance exactly how much flour, salt, sugar, salted meat, and dried beans remained for the winter. I have a system, Bessie said, arms crossed. Your system requires you to be alive and present every time someone needs to find the cornmeal, Clara replied, not looking up from the jar she was labeling in clean, precise handwriting. My system requires literacy, which everyone in this house possesses. Bessie stared at her, then laughed. A real laugh, the kind that shook her shoulders and made her eyes water. She had not laughed like that since before Thomas Garrett died. Clara had also taken over the ranch correspondence, which had been in chaos since the last accountant quit 6 months prior. Emmett handed her a stack of papers 2 inches high and watched her sort them in half an afternoon with a precision that made him look at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents, as if verifying that the same person who had arrived in borrowed boots was now organizing his filing system better than he ever had. You're wasted as a mail-order bride, Emmett told her one afternoon, leaning in the study doorway while she reconciled 3 months of cattle sale receipts against bank deposit records. You should be running a bank. Women don't run banks. Women don't ride into blizzards either. You seem to specialize in things women don't do. Boone's sessions with Clara in the barn became her favorite hours at Granite Peak. He taught her how to approach a pregnant horse. Slow from the side. Place your hand on the neck first. Speak low. Let her learn your scent before you ask anything of her body. Then the belly, palm flat. Pressure gentle but firm enough to feel the movement within. She likes you, Boone said when Copper leaned her big chestnut head against Clara's shoulder and blew warm breath across her neck. She likes anyone who brings apples. No, horses no. Boone's amber eyes, the same color as his brother's, but warmer lit from somewhere behind the iris rather than in front of it, held hers. They feel who's real and who's performing, like people but more honest about it. He taught her to check hooves, to read a horse's weight distribution, to feel for heat in the hoof wall that might indicate the beginning of laminitis. Clara listened the way she did everything, carefully, completely, asking questions that showed she was not just hearing, but understanding. And Boone, who had spent his entire adult life communicating more easily with animals than with people, found himself talking more than he had in months. about the breeding program he wanted to start, about Copper's bloodline and what the foal might become, about the way horses remember kindness longer than they remember cruelty, which was, he said, the opposite of how most men operated. These sessions in the barn established something essential. Each brother interacted with Clara differently, and she noticed. Silas watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Emmett analyzed her with a strategic mind she could practically hear clicking. But Boone simply shared what he knew with someone who wanted to learn. And the warmth of that simplicity was something Clara had not felt since her father read to her on winter evenings in Boston. Before the ship sank, before the money disappeared, before the world stopped being kind. Then midday on the fourth day of the blizzard, Gus Redmond burst through the door. North fence is down, 40 head drifting toward Pine Creek Ravine. Every man in the room understood what that meant. Pine Creek Ravine was a 100-foot drop onto rocks and frozen creek bed. Cattle driven by wind and panic would walk straight off the edge without understanding what was happening until it was too late. The Garrett brothers moved as a single unit. Years of crisis response compressed into instant action. Silas issued orders. Emmett coordinated the men. Boone saddled the horses. And Clara Whitfield, standing in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands and fire in her eyes, said 4 words that changed everything. "I'm coming with you." All 3 brothers turned. For one moment, they looked so identical in their shock that Clara almost smiled. "You can't. Not out in this weather," Silas said. "Can you?" "That's different." "Why, because you're I rode through Massachusetts blizzards for 3 winters. My father kept horses. I can sit a saddle. This isn't Massachusetts." "I know. Harder weather, harder land, harder men." She faced him directly. "But those cattle won't wait for your pride to settle, and you need every rider you have." Emmett grinned. He could not help it. Boone looked at Silas with an expression that communicated volumes without a single word. "Fine," Silas said through teeth that could have cracked walnuts. "But you stay between Emmett and Boone. You follow orders, and if I say come back, you come back." "Agreed." 20 minutes later, they rode into hell. The wind tried to rip them from their saddles. Snow came sideways, horizontal, blinding. The temperature was so far below zero that every exposed inch of skin burned within seconds, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. The horses fought for each step, their powerful legs plunging through drifts that reached their bellies. Clara rode between Emmett and Boone as ordered. Her seat was good, better than good. She rode the way someone rides who learned young and never forgot her body moving with the horse rather than against it. Her hands quiet on the reins, her balance instinctive. Emmett noticed, Boone noticed. Silas, who rode ahead of them all, forced himself not to look back. They reached the cattle, 40 head, maybe more, stumbling through deep snow toward the ravine edge, driven by wind and blind panic, pushing forward into darkness and death without knowing the difference. "Circle them!" Silas shouted over the roar of the storm. "Turn the lead animals toward the eastern shelter." The riders spread out. Silas went left. Gus took the right flank. Emmett moved to block the ravine approach. Boone held the center, and Clara, against every order, against every reasonable instinct, saw Virgil Hale riding directly into the path of the lead cattle. The young hand was about to be caught between panicked animals in a 100-foot drop, and he did not see it coming because the snow had stolen his visibility and the wind had stolen his hearing, and death was coming at him from the front while he watched the wrong direction. Clara spurred her horse forward. She cut across the herd's path, forcing the lead animals to turn, using her horse's body as a wall between the stampede and the young man who had seconds to live. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It was absolutely and completely necessary. Virgil saw her, understood what she had done, veered to safety with a shout that the wind swallowed whole. Then her horse hit ice. The animal went down hard, legs folding beneath it like something broken. Clara was thrown from the saddle, her body arcing through the air in a trajectory that was all wrong, landing in deep snow 10 feet from the ravine edge, 10 feet from a 100-foot drop onto rock. Silas saw it happen. Time stopped. His heart stopped. Every thought in his head, every calculation about cattle and contracts and fortress walls evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat and was replaced by something raw and absolute and terrifying. He was off his horse before conscious thought caught up with action, running through snow that fought every step reaching for her. Clara was already trying to stand. Her leg buckled beneath her, and she went down again, face contorted with pain. "Don't move," he shouted. "The cattle? Forget the cattle." But she was right. The herd was still dangerously close to the edge. One spooked animal could take a dozen over with it. Emmett appeared beside them, sliding from his horse with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that panic helps no one. "I have her. Go finish this." Silas looked between the cattle and Clara, between duty and something he refused to name but could no longer deny existed. "Go," Clara shouted from the snow. "I'm fine." She was not fine. She was pale and shaking and 10 feet from death. But the cattle needed him, and Boone was alone trying to hold the center, and 40 head of breeding stock, worth more than most men earned in 5 years, were seconds from destruction. Silas ran back to his horse, swung into the saddle, and drove the remaining animals away from the ravine with a fury that had nothing to do with livestock and everything to do with the image of a small woman in a navy dress being thrown toward a 100-foot drop. It took another hour to secure the herd in the eastern shelter. By the time they finished, Silas was half frozen and Clara was unconscious across Emmett's saddle. Boone rode on her other side, one hand steadying her body against the wind, his face white with a fear that had nothing to do with cold. The ride back to the ranch house was the longest of all three brothers' lives. Bessie took charge the moment they carried Clara through the door. 3 hours of work, warming her slowly, treating the twisted ankle, wrapping bruises. Finally, Bessie emerged into the hallway where Silas had been pacing like something caged. "She'll live. Twisted ankle, some bruising, nothing broken. She got lucky." "Lucky," Silas repeated. "Another 10 minutes in that cold, and we'd be having a different conversation entirely." Bessie studied him, really studied him the way only a woman who has watched boys become men, and men become something harder, can study a person. "She saved Virgil's life out there, Silas. Cut the herd off before it could push him over the edge. You saw that. I never should have let her come. You couldn't have stopped her." Bessie's voice softened. "That woman has steel in her spine. Reminds me of someone else I know." Silas stared into the hallway after Bessie left, alone with the sound of Clara breathing through the closed door. And he whispered something he had not said aloud in years, had not believed in years, had not allowed himself to need in years. Winter always ends. He was not sure if he was talking about the storm outside or the one inside him. But standing there listening to the woman who had walked through a blizzard and then ridden into a stampede to save a stranger's life, he thought perhaps for the first time since Catherine Prescott had boarded a train and taken his trust with her, that the walls he had built might not need to be quite so high. He opened the door, sat down in the chair beside her bed, and waited, because Clara Whitfield had come to Granite Peak asking for nothing, expecting nothing, carrying nothing but $37 worth of courage and a refusal to let fear make her decisions. And somehow that was more dangerous than any proposal, any dowry, any calculated arrangement that 23 women in 5 years had offered. She had not asked to be let in. She had simply knocked. And the fortress for the first time had not known how to keep the door closed. The days accumulated, small moments layered upon each other like snowfall, each one insignificant alone, but collectively transforming the landscape until you could not remember what it looked like before. On the 5th morning of the blizzard, Clara found Silas behind the house splitting firewood. He had been at it for an hour already, judging by the pile of split logs stacked neatly beside the chopping block. She stood in the doorway watching him work, and he did not notice her. There was a beauty to it that she had not expected. The way he placed each log on the block with precision, centering it, reading the grain the way a man reads terrain before crossing it. The way he lifted the axe over his right shoulder in one smooth arc, his body coiling like a spring. All that power held in check for one instant before releasing it downward in a strike that split the wood cleanly every time. Same angle, same force, same result. A man who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more and never once consider it beneath him. "Teach me," she said. Silas turned axe in hand, snow in his dark hair. "What? Splitting wood? If I'm staying here, I need to know how." He wanted to say no. She could see the refusal forming on his face the way clouds form before a storm, the instinct to protect his solitude, to keep her at the distance where people were safe and manageable and could not reach the parts of him that still bled. But then he remembered what she had said her first night. Why? Because you're a man, and instead of refusing, he reached for the smaller axe hanging on the wall of the woodshed and placed it in her hands. Left foot forward, right hand at the base of the handle, left hand slides up when you lift, slides down when you swing. Power comes from the shoulders, not the arms. Look at where you want the blade to land, not at the blade itself. Her first swing missed the log entirely and buried the axe head in the chopping block. Her second glanced off the side, nearly flying out of her grip. Silas stepped behind her, close enough to correct her stance, not close enough to touch. Here, grip here. He adjusted the position of her hands on the handle, his calloused fingers briefly covering hers. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Neither of them breathed during those 2 seconds. And don't watch the axe. Watch the wood. Her third swing split the log into 2 pieces. Not clean. The halves were uneven, the angle slightly off. But split. Accomplished. Done. Clara looked up, and there was something in her expression that made Silas forget he was supposed to be maintaining distance. Not pride. Something deeper. The pure surprise of discovering capabilities she did not know she possessed. The face of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told what she could not do and had just done something nobody told her she could. Good, he said, one word. But from Silas Garrett, who measured language the way a miser measures gold coins, it was a fortune. The blizzard held Granite Peak for 2 more days after that morning, and during those days the house changed in ways that none of them could name, but all of them could feel. Like the temperature rising 1 degree at a time. You cannot feel a single degree, but you can feel the difference between frozen and thawing. Silas found a blanket draped over him when he fell asleep reading in the library and knew without asking whose hands had placed it there. Clara discovered that someone had repaired the loose heel on her borrowed boots overnight. The stitching precise and strong and new, without asking which brother's hands had done the work. Emmett noticed that the account ledgers now balanced to the penny for the first time in 2 years, and said nothing but started leaving his most complex correspondence on the desk where Clara worked, knowing she would organize it before he returned. Boone made a bracelet from braided leather cord and pressed it into Clara's hand one evening, with words spoken so quietly that only she could hear them. So you remember you were wanted here. And through it all, Silas orbited Clara the way a man orbits something he is afraid to touch but cannot stop approaching. He found reasons to be in whatever room she occupied. Then found reasons to leave. He asked questions that sounded practical but carried subtext he could not quite articulate. How are the accounts coming? Is your ankle better? Did Bessie feed you lunch? The questions meant something else entirely. Are you still here? Will you still be here tomorrow? What is happening to me? And how do I make it stop without making you leave? Then the storm broke. On the 7th morning, sunlight flooded through the library windows for the first time in a week, turning the snow-covered valley into a landscape of blinding gold. Clara stood at the window, watching the transformation, one hand resting on the glass as if she could feel the warmth through it. She did not hear Silas enter behind her. Road should be passable by tomorrow, he said. Hey, no. You could leave. I could. Is that what you want? Now she turned, and the morning light caught her face in a way that made Silas's chest tighten, with something that was not desire and not fear, but some unnamed territory between them that he had spent 6 years pretending did not exist. A territory that had no map and no fence and no contract governing its terms. What I want doesn't change reality, she said. I came here as a mail-order bride. You don't want a bride. None of you do. You made that clear 23 times before I arrived. You're not them. The words escaped before he could catch them. They hung in the air between them, more honest than anything he had said, in 6 years more dangerous than any ravine or blizzard or stampeding herd. He could not take them back. He was not sure he wanted to. I feel like this house has been empty for years, and I didn't notice until you filled it, he said, his voice rough. Like a man speaking a language he has not used in so long that the words come out scraped and raw. I feel like you see things about me that I've spent a decade hiding, and instead of using them against me, you just see them. Every reason I had for pushing people away doesn't apply to you. And that terrifies me more than anything Crawford or the weather, or this territory can throw at me. Silas, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to love three difficult men on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. I'm asking you to stay long enough for us to figure out if this is real. Clara studied his face the way she studied everything, searching for the angle, the calculation she had learned to expect from men who wanted something. She did not find it. What she found instead was sincerity so raw, it was almost painful to look at directly, like staring at the sun on fresh snow. 1 month, she said. Give me 1 month. Let me stay. Let me work. Let me see if this is real or just two lonely people finding comfort in proximity. If it's real, we'll figure out what comes next. If it's not, I leave. No guilt, no blame. 1 month, he agreed, but I won't pretend I don't care about you during that month. If I'm feeling something, I'm saying it. Honesty works both ways. Agreed. The kiss when it happened was not planned by either of them. Silas reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so tender it surprised them both because tenderness was not something Silas Garrett practiced, and accepting it was not something Clara Whitfield expected. Their eyes met. The distance between them, which had been simultaneously too much and not enough since the moment she walked through his door, simply ceased to exist. He leaned forward. She did not step back. And when their lips met, it was not with urgency, but with the careful honesty of two people who had been hurt before and were choosing to trust again, despite every scar telling them not to. When they separated, Clara's eyes were bright. That was terrifying. Absolutely. Good. I'm terrified too. He almost smiled. She almost laughed. And standing together in the golden morning light for one brief and perfect moment, the future did not look like more of the same. I didn't expect you, Silas said quietly, but I'm not letting you go. The future, however, had its own plans, and those plans arrived on horseback approximately 90 minutes later. Silas and Clara were on the porch. She was helping Bessie hang washed linens in the post-storm sun, and he was repairing a shutter the wind had torn half off its hinges. Ordinary work, the kind of work that fills a morning when you are trying not to think too hard about the fact that your life changed in a library an hour and a half ago. Then a rider appeared on the road, not from town, from the east, riding hard. Clara saw him first. The blood drained from her face so completely that Silas thought for a moment she was going to faint. Her hands, which had been steady through blizzards and stampedes and midnight confessions, began to tremble. No, she breathed. Silas was beside her instantly. Who is it? She could not answer, could not breathe. Because riding toward Granite Peak Ranch, with the easy confidence of a man who believed he held every card in the deck, was Harold Whitfield. Her uncle, the man she had fled Boston to escape, the man who had tried to sell her to a 55-year-old businessman like livestock at auction. Emmett materialized from the stable. Boone came from the barn. Both brothers read the situation the way men who have lived together their entire lives read situations, instantly and without requiring explanation. Clara, Harold called dismounting with practiced ease. He was 48, well-dressed for a cross-country journey, with the kind of pleasant face that concealed unpleasant intentions, the way a clean tablecloth conceals a dirty table. I've been looking everywhere for you, dear. You had us all so worried. She's not your concern. Silas stepped forward, placing his body between Clara and her uncle, all 6 feet 6 inches of him. 230 pounds of muscle built by 14 years of mountain ranch work. A wall of flesh and fury, and the kind of quiet menace that most men recognized as a warning and wise men recognized as a promise. I'm Harold Whitfield, Clara's legal guardian and her late father's brother. Harold's smile did not waver, but his eyes measured the three brothers with the sharp assessment of a man calculating odds. I've come to bring her home. She is home, Boone said from behind Silas, and there was a quality in the youngest Garrett's voice that nobody at Granite Peak had ever heard before. Not the softness he used with horses, not the gentleness he carried like a second skin. This was steel, the quiet, absolute steel of a man drawing a line he would die before allowing anyone to cross. Harold produced papers from his coat with a flourish that suggested rehearsal. Debt documents totaling $17,000. A warrant for Clara's arrest from a Massachusetts territorial court. The documents looked official. Heavy paper, proper seals, signatures in the right places. Robert Whitfield died owing considerable sums. Harold explained, his voice carrying practiced sympathy. As his daughter and sole heir, Clara is legally responsible. But I've come with a generous offer. Return to Boston. Accept Mr. Braddock's proposal. The debts disappear. Those papers are forged, Uncle Harold, Clara said, stepping around Silas. Her voice had steadied, the initial shock replaced by something harder. Something forged in the same buyer that had driven her to walk 12 miles through a blizzard. Or fabricated. Father's debts were real, but they weren't $17,000. Prove it. She doesn't need to prove anything, Silas said. His voice dropped to the register that both brothers recognized as the most dangerous sound he made. Not louder, quieter. The voice of a man who has stopped calculating and started deciding. You prove them legitimate through proper legal channels in Wyoming territory. Now get off my land. Harold retreated, but not before delivering a carefully aimed parting shot. He paused in the saddle and looked back at them, his pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. I met an interesting man in Cheyenne, Silas, a senator. Very interested in your ranch, very interested in your water rights, and very, very interested in the kind of woman you're keeping under your roof. He rode away, but the damage was already done. Because if Harold Whitfield had connected with Senator Douglas Crawford, then Clara's past and the Garrett brothers' enemy had become the same storm. Two threats merging into one. And a storm that comes from two directions at once is the kind that tears down houses. Harold took a room at the hotel in Redstone and waited, giving Clara until week's end. He was confident. He had documents after all, official-looking papers with seals and signatures, and the weight of institutional authority behind them. But Clara used the time differently. She asked Emmett to ride to Cheyenne and retrieve copies of her father's business records from the territorial banking system, public records accessible to anyone with the name and reason to request them. Emmett went using the Garrett name and resources and returned 2 days later with evidence that told a very different story. Robert Whitfield's actual debts at time of death, $4,300, not $17,000. The inflated figure was pure invention. More damning still, the court seal on Harold's warrant had been discontinued 2 years before the date printed on the document. It was a forgery using an outdated stamp, a mistake that only someone unfamiliar with territorial court procedures would make, or someone too arrogant to check. And most devastating of all, Clara examined the ledger and recognized what Emmett's sharp but unfamiliar eyes could not. 3 different handwritings contributed to the entries, and the dates were impossible. Transactions recorded in June signed with Robert Whitfield's name and handwriting that did not match the careful looping penmanship she had watched her father use for 20 years. Her father had been buried in April. Dead men do not sign ledgers 2 months after their funerals. But Clara found something else in those Cheyenne records, something she had not expected, and that cut deeper than any forged document. 3 wire transfers from her father's business account to an account held under a different name, but at the same bank branch Harold used. The dates preceded the fleet's sinking by 6 months. Small amounts, 500 here, 300 there, but systematic, regular, deliberate. Harold had been siphoning money from his brother's company before it collapsed, weakening the reserves that might have saved the business when the fleet went down. He had not merely profited from Robert's death. He had accelerated the ruin that caused it, and then he had tried to sell the daughter to cover his tracks. Clara sat with this discovery in the lamplight of Emmett's study, the papers spread before her, and felt something shift inside her that was not anger, but its quieter, more dangerous cousin. Clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping a person will be better than they are and start seeing them exactly as they have always been. Her uncle had not merely failed to protect her father. He had helped destroy him. Clara walked into the Redstone Hotel dining room on a Tuesday morning with all 3 Garrett brothers at her back, not because she needed protection, but because they refused to let her face this alone. The dining room went quiet as they entered, every ear listening, every eye watching. 4 people walking with the kind of unified purpose that makes bystanders instinctively step aside and wait to see what happens next. Clara placed the evidence on Harold's breakfast table the way a card player lays down a winning hand, calmly, without flourish, letting the cards speak for themselves. The debt is $4,300, not $17,000, she said. The court seal was discontinued in 1876. Your document is dated 1878. The handwriting in your ledger belongs to at least 3 different people, none of whom are my father. And the transactions dated after his death are particularly creative, given that he was buried in April, and your ledger shows his signature in June. Harold's smile disappeared for the first time since Clara had known him. You're running a confidence scheme, Uncle Harold. Her voice carried through the silent room. Every diner, every server, every person in that hotel heard every word. The question is why? Did you lose the house gambling, drink away what father left? Or did you simply realize that without me married to Braddock, you have no claim to anything? She paused, drew one more sheet of paper from the stack. Or is it something else entirely? 3 wire transfers from father's business account, 6 months before the fleet sailed, to an account at the same branch you bank at under a name I didn't recognize. Until Emmett checked. She held his gaze without blinking. It's a name you used once before, isn't it, Uncle Harold? When you were running that land speculation scheme in Connecticut, before father bailed you out, before he trusted you with his business. The color drained from Harold's face. The dining room was so silent you could hear the clock ticking on the mantel across the room. You helped ruin him, Clara said. Her voice did not waver, did not rise, did not break. You took money from his business, weakened his reserves. And when the fleet sank, there wasn't enough insurance margin left because you had already drained it. My father died because you stole from him, and then you tried to sell his daughter to cover your debts. Harold had no answer. The evidence was too precise, too documented, too devastating to counter with charm or misdirection or the pleasant face he had worn like armor for 48 years. He agreed to a deal, $6,000 to disappear permanently. Silas provided the money without hesitation. Clara protested the amount. It's not about money, Silas said. It's about making sure he never comes back. Harold signed documents, real ones this time, renouncing all guardianship claims, all debt claims, all connection to Clara Whitfield. Emmett drafted them on the spot in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Hank Dawson witnessed them with the satisfaction of a man watching justice served at a breakfast table. But Harold Whitfield, riding out of Redstone with $6,000 in his coat, stopped at the telegraph office. The telegram was addressed to Senator Douglas Crawford in Cheyenne. The Garrett brothers are harboring a woman with a complicated past. The eldest is emotionally compromised. She is his weakness. This is your opportunity. 6 words at the end of that telegram changed everything. She is his weakness. 6 words that turned a defeated con man's parting spite into the weapon that would nearly destroy Granite Peak Ranch. What followed was a campaign of destruction conducted with the patient precision of a man who had spent 5 years trying to acquire Granite Peak Ranch and had finally found the leverage he needed. Senator Douglas Crawford was 55 years old, silver-haired, distinguished, the kind of man who looked trustworthy in photographs, in devastated lives, in boardrooms. He was not a simple villain. He genuinely believed that consolidating the Elkhorn Valley's water rights under territorial government control would benefit the region, would allow coordinated irrigation, prevent droughts from ruining small ranchers, create a system of shared access that would make Wyoming competitive with larger territories. The vision was legitimate. The method was corrupt. And buried beneath the public interest argument was the private fortune Crawford would make brokering water access to railroad companies and mining operations that needed the valley's streams. He saw himself as a visionary being blocked by a stubborn rancher who could not see the bigger picture. That self-image made him dangerous, because men who believe they are doing good are capable of far worse cruelty than men who know they are doing wrong. The first week Wesley Crawford arrived at Granite Peak requesting a cattle deal, 300 head of breeding stock at below market prices. The Garretts refused. Wesley dropped the mask of civility. My father doesn't enjoy being refused, Silas. People are beginning to ask questions about your judgment. The second week, the Territorial Bank required a $20,000 security deposit within 30 days, or they would call in every credit line Silas had extended to other ranchers. Farmers, cattlemen, families who survived lean years because Silas extended them credit without interest. Crawford was using Silas's own generosity as a weapon, pulling the thread that connected Granite Peak to every struggling family in the Elkhorn Valley. If Silas fell, they all fell, and Crawford knew it. The third week, three major suppliers refused to extend credit to Granite Peak. All three had recently received government contracts routed through Crawford's office. The message was clear. Do business with the Garretts, lose your government contract. Choose. That evening, Clara found Silas in the barn currying his horse with violent efficiency. The brushstrokes were too hard, too fast. An engine running hot with nowhere to direct the energy. The horse shifted uneasily under the pressure, and Silas did not notice, which told Clara more about his state of mind than any words could have. I heard about the bank, she said. Can you raise 20,000? I can, but it'll drain every reserve I have. 14 years of building and Crawford is dismantling it in 3 weeks. Then perhaps I should leave, take the pressure off. Silas threw the curry brush against the wall hard enough to crack the handle. The sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot, and every horse in every stall lifted its head. That is exactly what he wants, to divide us. Force me to choose between you and the ranch. But if staying destroys you, then I'll be destroyed honestly instead of safely. He turned to her, and the rawness in his eyes was something she had never seen from him. Not vulnerability. The conscious choice to stop hiding it. A man pulling down his own walls because the effort of maintaining them had finally become greater than the fear of what lay on the other side. I spent 6 years being safe, being alone, building walls so high nobody could reach me. And what did it get me? An empty house and a reputation as the man who can't be touched. The mountain doesn't care, Clara said softly. No, but I do. Wesley Crawford returned a second time, alone, on a Wednesday afternoon when Silas and Boone were checking the south herd. He found Clara on the porch hanging laundry. His horse was lathered from a hard ride, and his face carried none of the polished confidence he had worn on his first visit. Mrs. Garrett, he used the name deliberately, though Clara and Silas were not yet married. My father has asked me to convey a personal offer. $1,000 cash, a first-class train ticket to Boston. Letters of introduction to 3 wealthy families seeking household managers. You're trying to buy me, Clara said. I'm trying to save you. Wesley stepped closer. His voice shifted from his father's polished rhetoric to something more honest, and more unsettling because of its honesty. You understand numbers, Clara. I know you do. Emmett told half the territory about the woman who reconciled their accounts in an afternoon. So look at the numbers. Government contracts suspended. 40% annual revenue lost. Suppliers refusing credit. Operating costs increased 20%. Bank demanding $20,000 in security. At the current rate, Granite Peak will be insolvent within 8 months. And all of it stops immediately if I leave. All of it. Clara studied him. Wesley Crawford was not his father. She could see that now. He was 27, caught between a father he could not defy and principles he could not abandon. There was genuine conflict in his eyes. Not the calculated sympathy Harold had performed, but real discomfort with what he was being asked to do. You don't want to be here, she said. Wesley's jaw tightened. What I want is irrelevant. Is it? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the words that would haunt Clara for weeks. The words that struck at the deepest fear she carried, the fear she had never spoken aloud to anyone because naming it would make it real. Before you arrived, nobody could touch Silas Garrett. He was a fortress, impenetrable. My father spent 5 years trying every angle and nothing worked. But now Silas has something to lose beyond land and cattle. Wesley looked at her with eyes that held something uncomfortably close to compassion. You are his only vulnerability, not because you are weak, because he loves you, and love makes strong men breakable. The words landed like stones in still water. They touched Clara's deepest fear, the same pattern she had watched destroy her father. Love had not been enough to protect Robert Whitfield from ruin. Wanting someone had not saved him, and the wanting itself had made the loss unbearable. Do you want to be the reason he loses everything? Wesley asked softly. Or do you want to be the woman who saved him by having the courage to walk away? He left, and Clara stood alone on the porch, her hand still holding a wet sheet, the wind pulling it from her grip, and heard her father's voice in her memory, the way he said her name when the creditors came, The way his eyes looked when the insurance company refused the claim, the way his breathing changed in the weeks before pneumonia became the medical word for what really killed him. Shame. Emmett appeared in the doorway. He had heard every word. "Don't listen to him," Emmett said, after Wesley's horse disappeared down the road. "He's not entirely wrong about the numbers. He's entirely wrong about the part that matters." Emmett came to stand beside her, not leaning for once, standing straight, shoulders back, as though the moment demanded something more than his usual casual posture. "You're not Silas's weakness, Clara. You're the reason he's stronger than he's ever been. Before you, he fought for land. Now he fights for family, and a man who fights for family doesn't lose." Clara did not tell Silas immediately. She lay in her room that night listening to the sounds of the house settling into darkness and thought about packing, about the road down the mountain, about whether leaving would save Silas or destroy him, about whether staying would do the same. But then she remembered Silas's voice. "Don't decide my fate for me." She remembered Catherine Prescott, who had decided for Silas that he needed to change. Catherine had decided for him and walked away. Clara would not make the same mistake. She would not choose for him. She would give him the truth and let him choose for himself. The next morning, she told all three brothers everything. Every word Wesley had said, every number, every threat. She laid it on the long oak table the way she laid everything. Clean, honest, unsoftened. "He's afraid," Boone said. "He's trying to divide us because he knows that together we're stronger than he is. That's not a sign of his power. That's a sign that we're winning." "Then we stop playing defense," Clara said, "and we take his power away." While the brothers managed the siege, Clara took independent action. She had been cataloging the library for weeks, organizing the books by subject the way she organized everything systematically and completely. And during that work, she had discovered a trunk in the attic, buried beneath decades of dust, forgotten or deliberately hidden. Inside were dozens of sketches and watercolor paintings, Wyoming landscapes, cattle at sunset, wildflowers in mountain meadows. The colors were vivid. The perspective was intimate. Every painting captured the territory with a tenderness that spoke of deep love for the land, the kind of love that sees beauty in a frozen creek and loneliness in a mountain ridge, and chooses to put both on paper because both are true. Margaret Garrett's art, never shown to anyone, never sold, hidden in a trunk by a husband who could not bear to look at them after she died, and forgotten by sons who had been too young to know they existed. Clara took the train to Cheyenne alone, over Silas's furious objection. "You can't stop me any more than you could stop me from riding into that stampede," she told him. "And this time, nobody's life is at risk except my patience." The art dealer's face changed when he saw the paintings. Original frontier work by a woman artist. Extraordinarily rare. He handled each piece with the careful reverence of a man who understood that he was holding something that could not be replaced. $8,000 for the collection. Clara returned with a bank draft and a quiet smile. $6,000 for supplier debts. $2,000 toward the bank deposit. Silas's face went through shock, then anger, then grief for his mother's paintings, and then something harder to name. The realization that this woman had done what partners do. She had seen a problem and solved it. Not by asking permission, not by waiting for someone else to act, by identifying what needed to be done and doing it. The same way she had walked 12 miles through a blizzard, the same way she had ridden into a stampede, the same way she had faced down her uncle in a hotel dining room. The same woman, the same instinct. See the problem, fix the problem, move on. "You sold my mother's art," he said. "Your mother would have wanted her work to protect her sons." Silas laughed, a real laugh, genuine, full, the kind of laugh that surprised him more than it surprised anyone else because he had not known the sound was still in him. It came from somewhere below the fortress walls, from a room he had sealed shut 6 years ago, and it cracked something open that he could not close again and did not want to. "You're impossible. You need impossible. God help me, I do." The relief lasted one evening. A telegram arrived from the investigation board, a moral fitness review initiated by the governor's office at Crawford's request. The review had been accelerated, 2 weeks instead of months, and the board's preliminary recommendation was that Clara Whitfield be removed from the property as a condition for contract reinstatement. On what grounds? Emmett demanded. Improper cohabitation. Marshal Gideon Falk stared at the floor. He was 50 years old, honest to the bone, and visibly uncomfortable with the papers he was required to deliver. The board chairman is Crawford's former business partner. Two other members received appointments through Crawford's recommendation. It's rigged, but the ruling is still a ruling. When does the removal take effect? 48 hours. The investigation fractured Redstone. On one side stood those who knew Silas's character. Ranchers he had helped, families he had funded, neighbors who had watched three boys build an empire from nothing. On the other stood those who were afraid, whose livelihoods depended on contracts that Crawford controlled, who could not afford to defy a territorial senator even if they wanted to. 20 townspeople appeared at the edge of Garrett property one evening. Some carried torches for visibility in the gathering dark. The scene was tense, uncertain. It could tip either way. A crowd with torches is never more than one wrong word from becoming a mob, and a mob with torches is never more than one wrong moment from becoming a tragedy. Is it true, Garrett, you're harboring a woman who's brought trouble to this valley? Silas stood on the porch, rifle in hand, barrel pointed at the ground. Emmett flanked his right, Boone his left, three brothers in a line. The same formation they had held against weather and debt and grief and loss for 11 years. The formation that said, we do not move. Clara Whitfield is a member of my household. She has worked harder in 3 weeks than most hands I've hired in 3 years. She saved Virgil Hale's life during the blizzard, and she's not the reason Crawford is threatening this valley. Water rights are the reason. Power is the reason. Clara is just the excuse. Then Bessie pushed through the crowd, followed by the blacksmith's wife, the general store owner, a widow named Mrs. Patterson. You should be ashamed, Bessie said, and her voice carried the authority of a woman who had fed half of Redstone at some point or another and remembered every single one of them. This man funded your school, built your church, donated cattle when the Henderson family lost everything. And you're turning on him because some politician in Cheyenne tells you to. The blacksmith stepped forward. You shod my son's horse for free, Garrett. Said family takes care of family. I believed you then. I believe you now. Mrs. Patterson. Silas Garrett extended me credit when the bank wouldn't. No interest, no collateral. Just pay me when you can. The Henderson family. We owe our livelihood to this ranch. We're not turning our backs because a politician says we should. One by one they came. Not all. About a third melted into the darkness, unwilling to risk Crawford's wrath. But the rest stayed. They stayed because they knew what Silas Garrett was and what he was not, and because the people you help when they are down are the people who stand with you when the world tries to push you over. Stand with us, Silas said. If Crawford puts one of us on his blacklist, he puts all of us on it. That's a harder fight for him than picking us off one at a time. Clara watched from the porch and felt something shift inside her. She had come to Granite Peak expecting nothing, caring nothing, planning for nothing beyond survival. Instead, she had found a family that extended beyond the ranch house, beyond the brothers, to an entire community built on the principle that people take care of each other. Not because it is profitable, but because it is right. This is why you stay, she murmured. What? Amitus asked. These people. It was never just about land or water or cattle. It was about them. Built this with our own hands, Hank said, standing behind them in the doorway. All of us together. And nobody takes it apart without a fight. The 48-hour deadline arrived the next morning like a clock striking midnight in a fairy tale where the consequences are real. Clara began to pack. The navy blue dress, the borrowed boots, the few things she had acquired at Granite Peak. A hairbrush from Bessie. A book of poetry Silas had left on her nightstand without comment. The leather cord bracelet Boone had made, pressing it into her hand with words she would carry for the rest of her life. So you remember you were wanted here. She was folding the dress when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Silas's heavy tread, not Emmett's measured pace, not Boone's quiet step. These were the footsteps of a woman who had been climbing these stairs for 12 years and knew every creak and settle in every board. Bessie Monroe stood in the doorway. She looked at Clara. She looked at the half-packed bag. She looked at the dress folded on the bed. And then she looked down the hallway toward the study where Silas sat alone staring at a glass of whiskey he would not drink the same way his father had stared at whiskey the year before he died. Bessie looked back at Clara, and she said 6 words that changed everything. "Have you considered marrying the girl?" The question was not directed at Clara, it was directed at the house, at the silence. At 12 years of watching 3 boys become men who became something harder than men needed to be. At the empty chairs around a table built for 12. At the nursery that had never held a child. At the guest room that had been used twice in a decade. At the fortress that kept the world out and the loneliness in. 6 words, and they landed like a match on dry timber. Emmett processed the suggestion first. His mind moved through the legal implications the way it moved through cattle contracts, finding the angles, assessing the risks, mapping the outcomes. Marriage negates the entire improper cohabitation argument, he said. A wife has legal standing that a guest doesn't. It's elegant. Crawford's entire case rests on the impropriety argument. Marriage eliminates it completely. This is not a business transaction, Silas said. No, but it could be a solution that also happens to be the truth. Boone had not spoken. He stood at the window looking out at the valley where the moonlight turned the snow to silver and the mountains to shadows. The youngest Garrett had spent a month watching his eldest brother fall in love, and he had spent that same month doing something harder than anyone in the house understood, reconciling his own feelings with what he saw, which he saw happening. Boone admired Clara, more than admired her. She carried a gentleness wrapped in steel that reminded him of their mother, the same combination of softness and strength that Margaret Garrett had possessed, the warmth that drew people in and the iron that held them when the world tried to pull them apart. He cared about her in a way that went beyond friendship. But in the quiet hours he spent with horses and his own honest heart, he had learned something about himself that most men spend a lifetime avoiding. What he felt for Clara was not romantic love. It was recognition. He recognized in her the same quality he carried in himself, the belief that kindness was not weakness, that gentleness was not surrender, that the world could be met with an open heart and still survived. Clara had become a mirror that showed Boone what he valued most, and that understanding arrived at slowly in the lantern-lit hours of the barn, with Copper's warm breath on his hands, had freed him to accept that she belonged with Silas in a way she would never belong with him. Not because he was less, because they were different, and because the love that builds a home is different from the love that recognizes a kindred spirit. Do it, Boone said, turning from the window. Marry her, not because of Crawford, because you love her and you're too stubborn to say it without someone forcing your hand. Silas stared at his youngest brother. Boone held the gaze, steady, open, giving permission for something Silas had not known he needed permission for. She might say no. She won't, Emmett said. She came here with nothing and built herself into the center of everything. She rode into a stampede to save your ranch hand. She sold art to pay your debts. She's not going to decline spending the rest of her life with you. Emmett's voice carried warmth, real warmth. Not the analytical appreciation he usually showed, but something that sounded remarkably like love for both his brother and the woman who had changed him. Go ask her. We'll be here when you come back. Silas found Clara in the barn checking on Copper, running her hand along the mare's swollen belly the way Boone had taught her, her touch gentle, her attention complete. The lantern light caught her hair and turned it to gold, and the image of her there surrounded by horses and hay and warm animal breath was so far from the drawing rooms and society parlors he had been offered by 23 previous women that it struck him with almost physical force. This was what he wanted. Not a woman who fit a category, a woman who fit a barn. Bessie thinks we should get married, he said. Bessie thinks a lot of things. Emmett thinks it solves the Crawford problem. Emmett is right. Boone thinks I love you. Now she looked up. The lantern light caught her eyes and turned them luminous. Cornflower blue lit from within. And what do you think, she asked. I think Boone is right too. Silas, if we do this, it can't be about Crawford. I won't start a marriage as a defense tactic. It's not. He moved closer. His voice dropped to the register that was not about strategy or fortress walls or any of the armor he had worn for 6 years. It was about the man underneath, the man who had sat in a chair beside her bed and watched her breathe and felt for the first time since his father's funeral that he was not alone in a way that mattered. Marry me, not because Crawford is threatening us, because I can't imagine this ranch without you, because every room in that house was empty until you walked into it, because you see me, the dirt, the rough edges, the fear, all of it, and you're still here. I'm still here, she said, and it sounded like a vow already. Then say yes. Yes. He kissed her in the barn surrounded by horses and hay and lantern light, and it felt nothing like strategy and everything like coming home. A man keeps his word, Silas said quietly, and my word to you is that I will spend the rest of my life earning this. From the house watching through the kitchen window, Bessie wiped her eyes and started planning a wedding. 48 hours. Either she leaves or they lose everything. But there was a third option that neither the senator nor the law had anticipated, and it started at dawn. They married the next morning at sunrise. The ceremony took place in the Red Stone Church, a small, clapboard building with a steeple that leaned slightly east from years of prevailing wind. The wood had gone silver with age, and the windows were plain glass, not stained, because frontier churches were built for shelter and prayer, not for show. But on this morning, the plain glass did something that stained glass never could. It let the sun rise in without changing it. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridge, turning the snow to gold and the mountains to rose, the small church was full. Not with society guests, not with senators' daughters or bankers' nieces or merchants' cousins with political agendas and practiced smiles. The pews held ranchers and their wives, shop owners and their children, working people who had risen before dawn and ridden through cold to witness something they understood in their bones, what it means to build something from nothing, what it means to defend it with everything you have, what it means when two people choose each other, not because it is convenient, but because it is true. Clara wore her navy traveling dress, cleaned and pressed but to Bessie, who had spent half the night working on it with an iron heated on the cook stove and a determination that no amount of exhaustion could diminish. No veil, no bouquet, just the cameo brooch at her throat and dried wildflowers braided into her hair. Blossoms saved from last summer's harvest by Bessie, who had kept them in a cedar box for a day she had always believed would come, even when no one else did, even when every evidence suggested it never would. Bessie Monroe had kept those flowers because she understood something about hope that the Garrett brothers had forgotten. You do not wait for hope to arrive. You prepare a place for it. Silas wore clean work clothes and his father's pocket watch. He had refused a suit. She's not marrying a costume. She's marrying a rancher. The pocket watch hung from his vest, warm from his body, its ticking steady as a heartbeat. Thomas Garrett had carried it for 30 years. It had measured the hours of a man who built a ranch and lost a wife and died of the distance between those two things. Now it measured the hours of a son who had inherited the ranch and the loss and was choosing for the first time to close the distance. Hank Dawson walked Clara down the aisle. She had asked him that morning, standing in the kitchen before the coffee was ready, her voice quiet and certain. "You're the closest thing to family I've found in Wyoming," she told him. Hank had to turn away and cough several times before he could answer. When he turned back, his blue eyes were bright and his voice was steady, only because 62 years of frontier living had taught him how to hold things together when they wanted to come apart. "I'd be honored," he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a very long time. Emmett held the ring, their mother's ring, silver worn thin from decades on Margaret Garrett's hand. She had worn it through childbirth and cattle drives and blizzards and the slow, patient work of building a home in a place where the land tried to kill you every winter and rewarded you every spring. The ring carried all of that history in its thinness, in the way it caught light, in the warmth it held from every hand that had worn it. When Emmett placed it in Silas's palm, their eyes met, and a lifetime of brotherhood passed between them in a single glance. Every fence they had mended together, every storm they had survived, every silent breakfast at a table too large for three, every year of watching Silas build walls, and knowing that the walls were keeping out the very thing he needed most. Emmett nodded. It was enough. Boone stood beside Emmett. The youngest Garrett had spent a month watching his eldest brother fall in love, and he had spent that same month arriving at an understanding that most men take a lifetime to reach. When his eyes met Clara's during the ceremony, She saw every layer of what he felt: the care, the recognition, the acceptance, the release, the knowledge that love comes in many forms, and that the form he felt for Clara was not less than what Silas felt. It was different, and different was not a defeat. It was a completion. The small nod Clara gave him acknowledged everything and thanked him without a word. Boone nodded back, and something finished itself between them that had been unfinished since the night he pressed a leather bracelet into her hand and told her to remember she was wanted here. The answer was, "We are family." And that is more than enough. Silas's vows were simple, the kind of words a man carves into wood rather than writes on paper, because wood lasts longer and means more. I promise to be honest, to fight beside you, not for you, to never ask you to be smaller or larger than you are, to protect this family, all of it, with everything I have. He paused, his voice, which could command 12 ranch hands and 4,000 head of cattle, without rising above a conversational tone, trembled on the next words. A man keeps his word, and my word is yours. Clara's vows carried the weight of every mile she had walked to reach this moment. 12 miles through a blizzard and a lifetime before that. I promise to stay, even when staying is hard, even when the world outside these mountains tries to tear us apart. I choose this, choose you, choose this family, choose this life, every single day. They kissed as husband and wife. The church erupted in applause. And outside, the Wyoming sun broke through clouds that had covered the valley for weeks, as if the sky itself had been waiting for permission to shine. The wedding purchased legal protection, but it did not end the war. Wesley Crawford arrived within hours. The investigation board had issued its ruling despite the marriage. All government contracts suspended. The chairman had declared the marriage a transparent attempt to circumvent oversight, and any business associates continuing to deal with Granite Peak might face their own reviews. The ruling was legally questionable. Emmett knew it. The territorial courts would likely overturn it on appeal. But an appeal took months, and Crawford did not need months. He needed weeks. Weeks of financial pressure, weeks of suppliers refusing credit, weeks of the bank holding its security demand over Silas's head like an axe. Weeks was enough to bleed Granite Peak dry. Wesley came back 3 days after the wedding. This time he came alone. But the air around him was different. The polished confidence had cracks in it, the kind of cracks that form when a man is being asked to do something that violates his own sense of who he is. He found Clara on the porch. Mrs. Garrett now, legally and irrevocably. Mrs. Garrett, my father asked me to convey a final offer, $10,000, enough to start over anywhere. No, Wesley exhaled, and then he said something that surprised them both. Good. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, not as an enemy, but as a person. She saw a man who had spent 27 years watching his father use power like a weapon, who had been raised in the shadow of ambition so consuming it left no room for the son who stood in it, who had been taught that might was right and that compassion was weakness, and who had never quite believed either lesson. You don't agree with what he's doing, Clara said. It was not a question. Wesley's jaw worked. The muscles in his neck tightened. He was fighting something, an internal war between loyalty and conscience that had been escalating for weeks. My father has done things, Wesley said slowly, choosing each word like a man crossing a frozen river, testing each step before committing his weight. Things that go beyond water rights and cattle contracts. I've seen documents, payments to the bank board, instructions to the investigation chairman, a letter to the governor suggesting that Granite Peak's water supply could be redirected to serve mining interests. His mining interests, disguised as public infrastructure. Are you telling me this as a warning, Clara asked, or as evidence? Wesley looked at her. His eyes held hers. I'm telling you because I don't want to become my father, and if I stay silent, I will. What Wesley Crawford did next required more courage than any cattle rescue or blizzard crossing or midnight confession. He rode to Cheyenne, not to his father's office. To the offices of Warren Lacey, editor of the Cheyenne Register. He carried a satchel. Inside were copies of documents he had removed from his father's study over the course of 3 weeks. Carefully, methodically, one page at a time, hidden beneath his coat, transported by a man who understood that what he was doing would end his relationship with his father permanently and irrevocably, and who did it anyway because the alternative was becoming the thing he most despised. Payment records to the Bank Advisory Board. Instructions to the investigation chairman detailing exactly how to structure the moral fitness review to produce a predetermined outcome. A letter to the governor discussing the redirection of Elkhorn Valley water rights to mining operations owned by Crawford's business associates, dressed in the language of public interest, the way fresh paint covers rotting wood. And the telegram from Harold Whitfield, the 6 words that had started the entire campaign. She is his weakness. Wesley laid them on Warren Lacey's desk, cleanly, without flourish, letting the truth speak for itself. These are copies of documents from my father's personal files, Wesley said. They show a coordinated campaign to destroy a private rancher's livelihood in order to acquire his water rights for personal profit. Bank manipulation, government board stacking, supplier blackmail, all documented. Warren Lacey was 60 years old, white-haired, sharp-eyed, deeply unimpressed by power, which was the occupational hazard of spending 40 years watching powerful men do small things. He read every page, checked every date, cross-referenced every name. You understand what you're asking me to do, Lacey said. I'm asking you to tell the truth. Your father will be destroyed. My father destroyed himself. I'm just making it public. And you, what happens to you? Wesley stood. He was 27 years old, and for the first time in his life, the weight on his shoulders was his own and not his father's. I suppose I'll find out. Meanwhile, at Granite Peak, the Garretts had been building their own case. Not with the frantic desperation of people fighting for survival, but with the methodical patience of people who understood that the truth once assembled is its own weapon. Silas obtained bank records confirming Crawford's position on the advisory board and the suspicious timing of the security deposit demand. Requested 48 hours after Harold's telegram. Rubber stamped by a board member who owed Crawford 3 years of political favors. The connection was documented. The timing was damning. Emmett researched the investigation board and confirmed that the chairman was Crawford's former business partner. 2 other members had received territorial appointments through Crawford's recommendation. The board was not oversight, it was a tool. A weapon shaped like justice and wielded like a club. Boone talked to the suppliers individually. The youngest Garrett's gentleness served him well in these conversations. Men who would have bristled at Silas's intensity or deflected Emmett's analysis found themselves telling Boone the truth, because his quiet sincerity made dishonesty feel like kicking a good horse. You could do it, but you would not feel right about it afterward. 2 of 3 suppliers admitted they had received direct pressure from Crawford's office. 1 agreed to provide a written statement. Clara connected the final piece. Harold Whitfield's telegram to Crawford had been the catalyst for the entire campaign. Private information about a family's personal circumstances, weaponized by a public official for private gain. She laid the evidence out on the long oak table in Emmett's study, organizing it the way she organized everything. By date, by connection, by consequence. Until the pattern was so clear that even a man who wanted to look away could not. They rode to Cheyenne on a Thursday morning to meet Warren Lacey. The editor sat them in his office, a room that smelled of ink and paper, and the particular kind of coffee that journalists drink, which is to say coffee that has given up on being good and settled for being strong. On his desk alongside the Garrett evidence sat Wesley Crawford's documents. Lacey looked at the assembled proof. From the Garretts and from the senator's own son. 2 separate sources. 2 independent sets of documents. Each one confirming the other. Each one devastating alone. Together they were annihilating. You understand what you're asking me to do, he said. We're asking you to tell the truth, Clara replied. Which story do you want to be remembered for, Emmett added. Lacey considered. Give me 3 days, then it runs. Front page, 6 columns. They rode home and waited through the longest night any of them had known. The 4 of them sat at the long oak table, all 12 chairs empty except theirs. The house quiet except for the fire crackling and the wind outside and the sound of their own breathing. I could dissolve the marriage, Clara said quietly. If I leave, the contracts are reinstated. The bank backs off. Crawford gets what he wants without a fight. No. 3 voices, simultaneously. Silas, Emmett, Boone. speaking as one without hesitation, without looking at each other, without needing to consult or calculate or weigh the options. The word was not discussed. It was automatic, instinctive, the sound of a family that has decided what it is and will not be told otherwise. "We don't run," Silas said. "We don't abandon each other," Boone added. "And we don't negotiate with men who use other people's pain as leverage," Emmett finished. "The story runs tomorrow," Clara said. "What if it's not enough?" Silas took her hand across the table. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, and the gesture was so natural and so foreign at the same time that it made his chest ache with the strangeness of being known. "Then we rebuild. I built this ranch from 200 acres in stubbornness. If Crawford tears it down, I'll build it again." "We'll build it again," Emmett corrected. Boone reached across and placed his hand over theirs. Emmett did the same. 4 hands on that long stretch of oak. A family forged by choice, by courage, by the refusal to let fear determine the shape of their lives. "Winter always ends," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Her hand was warm. Morning came. Warren Lacey's story hit the territory like a hammer hitting glass. 6 columns, front page. Every thread of Crawford's campaign laid out in documented, irrefutable detail. The bank manipulation. How Crawford used his board position to trigger the security deposit demand within 48 hours of receiving Harold Whitfield's telegram. The stacked investigation board. Chairman was Crawford's former business partner. 2 members owed their appointments to Crawford's recommendation. The moral fitness review was a weapon disguised as oversight. The supplier blackmail. Documented pressure from Crawford's office threatening government contract cancellations to anyone who did business with the Garretts. The water rights scheme. Crawford's private letter to the governor proposing to redirect Elkhorn Valley water to mining operations owned by Crawford's business associates dressed up in the language of public interest. And the source that made it devastating. The senator's own son, Wesley Crawford, named in the story, quoted in the story, standing on the record against his father. The editorial noted that the evidence had been independently verified through territorial records, bank filings, and witness statements from suppliers who had been pressured. The governor publicly condemned Crawford within hours. The legislature called for formal investigation. Citizens who had been quietly uncomfortable for years finally found their voice the way people do when someone else goes first, when someone else proves that speaking the truth will not kill you, even when it feels like it might. Crawford's allies scattered, each one running for shelter, desperate not to be caught in the open when the lightning struck. The investigation board chairman resigned before noon. The bank president issued a public apology before dinner. Suppliers sent representatives to Granite Peak before nightfall, hat in hand, asking to resume business. And the final telegram arrived as the sun set over the Elkhorn Valley, painting the mountains in colors that Margaret Garrett had once captured in watercolors that her daughter-in-law had sold to save her sons. Senator Crawford resigns effective immediately. Withdraws all claims. Territorial Governor's Office. Silas read it again, handed it to Clara. She read it, handed it to Emmett. He read it, handed it to Boone. Boone read it, then handed it back to Silas, because the circle needed to complete itself. Then Silas pulled Clara into his arms on the porch and held her while the ranch erupted around them. Virgil Hale threw his hat in the air. Gus Redmond shook hands with every man he could reach. Bessie sat on the porch steps and cried because some tears are not weakness, but release. The kind of tears that come when you have been holding your breath for so long that you forgot you were holding it until the moment you could finally let go. "Thank you," Silas whispered. "For what?" "For knocking on my door, for not leaving when I was impossible, for fighting beside us, for choosing us when giving up was easier." "I didn't choose easy," Clara said. "I chose honest. I chose real. I chose you." Behind them, Emmett and Boone stood shoulder to shoulder. Emmett spoke first. Actions, not words, and her actions told the whole story. The weeks that followed brought restoration and growth. Contracts reinstated. Suppliers competing for Garrett business. The bank offered expanded credit at preferential rates because guilt has its uses, and a bank president who has been publicly humiliated by a newspaper tends to overcorrect in the direction of generosity. But the real changes happened inside the house. Clara transformed Granite Peak through presence. The account books had never been cleaner. The correspondence flowed with precision. The library grew and Silas used the reading room every evening without shame. His big calloused hands turning pages while Clara read beside him, their shoulders touching, sharing silence the way people share bread, naturally, gratefully, without needing to name what it means. The nursery was opened, not yet occupied, but the dust sheets were removed, the windows cleaned, morning light allowed to fill a room that had waited 14 years for purpose. Copper delivered her foal on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Boone led Clara to the barn at dawn. The foal stood trembling on long legs, eyes enormous, all the awkward beauty of new life finding its balance. "You name her," Boone said. Clara looked at the foal, strong, new, full of possibility, everything that the winter had tried to kill and failed. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Boone smiled, the rare full smile that transformed his face from gentle to radiant. "Hope," he repeated. "That's perfect." That evening, Silas carved 2 sets of initials into the oak doorframe of the library. S.G. and C.G. The knife moved through the wood with the same precision he brought to everything. Each letter clean, each curve deliberate, the wood curling away in thin ribbons that fell to the floor like the shedding of something that was no longer needed. "Now it's official," he said. "The wedding wasn't official enough. The wedding was paper. This is wood." He looked at her, and the smile that crossed his face was the rare one, the one that reached his eyes and changed the geography of his entire face. Wood lasts longer. 6 months after the story published, a letter arrived at Granite Peak addressed to Clara. The handwriting was precise and careful. "Mrs. Garrett, I want you to know that the choice I made was not about your family or mine. It was about deciding what kind of man I wanted to become. My father built an empire on the principle that power justified any method. I watched him for 27 years. I learned his strategies, his contracts, his political mathematics, and I learned that none of it made him happy. Not for one day. I am ranching now. Small operation, 40 head, learning to build something with my hands instead of destroying things with my father's name. It is harder than I expected, but I find I prefer the honest difficulty of building to the comfortable misery of tearing down. I wish your family well. Wesley Crawford." Clara showed the letter to Silas. He read it. Then he dictated a response. "Crawford, if you need breeding stock to start ride to Granite Peak, we will find something in the herd, no charge. A man who chooses right when it costs him everything has already paid enough. Garrett." The seasons turned, spring softened the snow, summer painted the valley in wildflowers. Lupin, an Indian paintbrush, and columbine, the same flowers Margaret Garrett had painted in watercolors that now hung in a gallery in Denver, where strangers admired them without knowing that the woman who painted them had died in a ranch house on a mountain in Wyoming, and that her paintings had saved the ranch she loved, sold by a daughter-in-law she never met, to protect the son she raised. Clara stood barefoot in the meadow on the first warm day, grass wet beneath her feet, wind in her hair, and she cried, not from sadness, from the discovery that beauty still existed after everything, that the world had not used up its capacity for kindness, that joy was not something you earned but something you allowed. By staying open, by staying honest, by refusing to let fear close the doors that courage had opened. Silas found her there, did not ask why she was crying, just stood beside her and let the silence be enough. Because he had learned in the months since a woman walked through a blizzard to knock on his door that some silences are not empty, some silences are full. And the fullest silence of all is the one shared by 2 people who no longer need words to know they are not alone. Summer brought expansion. Silas built a cradle from oak, harvested from the tree Margaret Garrett had planted 30 years earlier when she first came to this mountain as a young bride herself. The wood was golden, fine-grained, smooth beneath his calloused hands. He worked on it in the evenings when Clara thought he was in the barn shaping each piece with the care of a man who understood that the thing he was building was not furniture, but future. And the surprise on her face when he presented it was worth every hour of hidden labor. Autumn brought Boone's horse breeding program to life with Hope as the foundation mare. Within 2 years, buyers came from 3 territories. The Garrett name, which had been synonymous with cattle for a decade, began to mean something new. Quality, integrity. The kind of stock that came from a ranch where the animals were treated like what they were, living things deserving of care. Emmett began receiving letters from Cheyenne. From a woman named Lenora Collins, a bookkeeper whose handwriting was as precise as her mind, and whose questions about territorial finance law were either a genuine professional inquiry or the most methodical courtship strategy Emmett had ever encountered. He suspected the latter. He admired the approach. He wrote to Cheyenne for business and returned with a smile that 33 years of living had never produced. A school teacher arrived in Redstone that September. Wren Barrett, young, kind, with a laugh that carried across schoolyards and into the hearts of children who did not know they needed a teacher until she appeared. Boone met her when he brought horses to the school for a children's field trip. What passed between them, the gentle, quiet recognition of two people who understood animals and children, and the importance of patience, was a story for another time. But Hank Dawson, watching from the porch that evening, as Boone rode home with a look on his face that Hank had not seen since Margaret Garrett was alive, nodded to himself and said nothing. Because some things do not need words. They just need witnesses. Winter came, and with it Clara gave birth to their first child. A girl. They named her Margaret, after the grandmother she would never meet but whose paintings had saved the ranch and whose ring now lived on her mother's hand, and whose notebook still rode in Boone's belt, and whose memory lived in every room of the house she had built, with a husband who loved her, and sons who remembered her, and a daughter-in-law who sold her art to save what she had built. Silas held his daughter for the first time, and his hands, which had broken wire and held reins and fought storms and built fences and split wood and repaired shutters and carved initials into door frames, and touched his wife's face with a tenderness that still surprised them both, trembled. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Clara said. "She's ours." Built this with our own hands. 30 years later, a summer afternoon, the porch of the main house at Granite Peak Ranch, the same porch where three brothers had stood on a February day and watched a woman walk toward them through the snow. Silas Garrett was 63. His hair had gone more silver than brown, thinner on top but still enough for the mountain wind to move. His shoulders remained broad, narrower than their peak but still powerful. The amber eyes were still sharp, still carrying the intensity that made hired hands straighten up and enemies reconsider. But around those eyes were lines that had not been there 30 years ago. Not worry lines, laugh lines, 30 years of laughing, something he had not known he was capable of before Clara knocked on his door. She sat beside him on the porch swing that Boone had built for Silas's 50th birthday. Oak frame, leather cushions, a slight creak when the wind pushed it. Clara was 52. Her hair showed silver at the temples, threaded through the honey blonde that still caught sunlight the way it had caught firelight the night she arrived. Her blue eyes were still bright, still seeing, still unafraid. Her hand was woven into Silas's on the armrest, a gesture so habitual that neither of them noticed it anymore. Like breathing, automatic, essential. On her left hand, Margaret's ring still shone, darkened with decades of wear, but never fully dim. Children's voices carried across the yard. 4 grandchildren. The oldest, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas, after his great-grandfather, was teaching his 5-year-old sister to catch beetles in the tall grass near the garden fence. 2 younger ones rolled on the lawn with a spotted dog that had wandered onto the property 3 years ago and never left because things that find their way to Granite Peak tend to stay. Margaret, their firstborn, now 30 years old, stood in the kitchen doorway where Bessie had stood for so many years. She had married at 22, Weston Hayward, the blacksmith's son, a young man who had grown up watching his father shoe Garrett horses and who had loved Margaret since she was 16 and who had waited with the kind of patience that only a man raised in the frontier understands. Together, they managed the south section of the ranch. She had inherited Bessie's philosophy of management, strict with love, efficient with warmth. Bessie had died the previous year, peacefully in her sleep with a batch of sourdough rising on the warming shelf and the kitchen as warm as it had ever been, as if she had decided that the house was finally in good hands and she could rest. Silas had cried at her graveside, standing on the hill behind the house where the wind blew hardest. "She would scold you for crying," Clara had said. "She would scold me for anything," Silas had answered, and laughed through the tears because that was how Bessie would have wanted it. Laughter and scolding, the 2 languages she spoke most fluently. Emmett and Lenora lived in the house they had built half a mile away. Their two sons, 15 and 13, ran with the other children across property lines that existed on paper but not in practice. Emmett still managed the ranch business, coffee in hand, Lenora beside him with a ledger she never quite stopped keeping. They argued about numbers the way other couples argued about curtains, with passion and precision and the absolute certainty that they were both right. Boone and Wren were in the barn. The Garrett horse program was famous across 3 states. Hope, the foal Clara had named, had lived to 27 and produced a bloodline that was the finest in the territory. Their daughter, 10 years old, rode better than most grown men and wanted to be a veterinarian. A profession everyone said was not for girls, which was exactly the kind of thing the women in this family specialized in. Doing what everyone said could not be done, and doing it so well that eventually everyone stopped saying it. Hank Dawson had died 10 years prior. Winter the way he always said he would go. In his boots, not his slippers. They buried him on the hill behind the house beside the plot that would one day hold all of them. Silas placed Thomas Garrett's pocket watch on the grave, the same watch he had carried on his wedding day, the same watch his father had carried for 30 years. It seemed right that it should rest with the man who had earned it, not through blood but through loyalty, through decades of showing up, through the quiet, stubborn refusal to leave. Every morning riding out to check the ranch, Silas passed that hill and tipped his hat. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Some conversations do not require words. They only require presence. "Do you ever regret it?" Claire asked, watching the grandchildren that chase each other through the wildflowers, risking everything for someone who showed up uninvited in a blizzard. Silas considered the question the way he considered everything. Seriously, thoroughly, with the full weight of a mind that measured before it spoke. "No," he said, "because I didn't risk everything for a stranger. I risked everything for the chance to stop being alone, and that chance turned out to be worth more than 15,000 acres." He looked at the valley, at the mountains, at the life they had built from nothing. "This mountain chose you, Clara. I just had the sense to agree with it." That's a significant statement from a man who used to count his worth in land. "I used to count my worth in land. Now I count it in people. You, my brothers, Bessie, Hank, the Hands. This family I ended up with despite spending 6 years trying to avoid one. The family found you anyway." "No, you found me, and the family followed." Inside, Margaret called everyone to dinner. Grandchildren stampeded through the door. Emmett and Lenora arrived hand in hand. Boone and Wren followed their daughter, riding on Boone's shoulders, laughing at something only children and horses understand. Silas stood and offered his hand to Clara. She took it. 30 years of taking that hand. "Do you remember what you said that first morning?" Clara asked. "In the morning you leave." Silas laughed, the full, genuine laugh that still surprised people who had known him in the fortress years. A laugh that had taken 30 years to perfect and that he had no intention of losing. "I remember. You were wrong. I was wrong about a great many things, but not about you. No, not about you." They walked inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the glorious mess of a family that should not have existed. That would not have existed if a desperate woman from Boston had not chosen a frozen mountain road over a comfortable cage. Because freedom mattered more than safety. Because honesty mattered more than comfort. Because walking 12 miles through a blizzard in borrowed boots was still better than standing still in a life that was not hers. She still remembered those 12 miles. Each step a choice to keep going when everything in her said stop. 30 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers, she thought that was the day my life began. And Silas, closing the door against the evening wind, placing his hand on the small of his wife's back, the way he had done every evening for 30 years, looked back once at the valley, at the land his father cleared, at the ranch his brothers helped him build, at the mountain that had tested every person who dared to live on it and had broken most of them and had not broken him. "You're home now," he said, to Clara, to the house, to himself, and the door closed on Granite Peak Ranch. And inside, a family sat down to dinner at a table built for 12. Every chair was full.